far enough amongst a large group. We've got a project in Laverne, Minnesota, which was 12 megawatts. And it was about a $15 million at that time, $15 or $16 million wind farm. And they raised their equity basically in 2 meetings where they had about 250 farmers and small businesses in their communities come in, and they all just took a little piece of it. And they syndicated it that way amongst themselves. And so you can do that, or you can work with entities that aggregate and have investment vehicles to do that. One thing to note that on all of our community-based development projects, we've used local bank debt financing. And when you look at 185 megawatts, that's over $300 million worth of stuff that we've done. And what we did is we were able to educate our local banks on how to collateralize the projects, how to use project finance, because we did not want to have this farming, this cash crop, interfere with the farming of the other cash crop. And so the debt financing had to be non-recourse financing. And so what that took was a couple of years of education to the banks saying this is how you collateralize. Use the power contract, the turbine, the warranty and service agreements from the manufacturer, the land lease, and the insurance policies, and you bring that together, and that collateralizes the loan, and you can do non-recourse financing that way. And then that bank, our local bank, went out and he called up all the other banks and basically syndicated the loan out throughout the state of Minnesota, North Dakota, some down in Nebraska, some down in Iowa. And so, I mean, every day more and more people are understanding that this is value, this is a real investment, it's a cash crop. I mean, wind energy, electricity is a cash crop. The big difference here is your carbines are about 200 feet in the air. But you take a natural resource, you turn it into a saleable commodity. If you have a buyer for your crop, you can finance the combine. And we've proven that many, many, many times over. And it's real.
What about the lifetime of the wind turbine? And what about the maintenance costs?
The life expectancy of the turbines? Most of the turbines today, modern turbines, are design life is around 20 years. That's the design life by the engineers. And maintenance is a big deal. We are very active in the operating and maintenance of the machines because that's the life of the machine. And so that's all part of the budget. When you factor your project, you put in a line item in there for your operations and maintenance costs. And some projects you can put in reserve. One thing that we do with community-based that's very important is we do not like to use the great big wind turbines. The great big wind turbines look really good on the performa. They look really good on the financial performa. But you get into dollars per delivered kilowatt hour over the life of that project, they don't look so good. Because if they break post-warranty, let's say in year 6, you have a major failure on some of your components, it costs you $250,000 to $300,000 to mobilize the crane to come in and fix it. And then you put that into your cash flow and it looks bad in a heartbeat. And so we look at smaller machinery. When I say smaller, it's still megawatt class machines, but it's easier to transport, it's easier to install. If you do have a problem, you can fix it without having to mortgage the farm. You spread your eggs out. So if one does have an issue, you still have a bunch of others running. And that's the general philosophy that we use in development, community-based development, which sets us aside from the great big wind farms, because the big wind farms say, well, let's put these great big machines, they look really good in the performance, and we're going to make a lot of money in the first few years. But in a community-based development, we're looking at the long-term value of these projects and delivering reasonably cost energy for a long time, and not just extracting near-term economics out of it and then letting somebody else worry about it later.
One more, if I may. You must have full net metering in Minnesota. We don't.
No, we have net metering, but it's only up to 40 kilowatts. But we negotiate power purchase contracts with our utility. And they have a nuclear plant, and they have coal plants, and they have gas plants. They have all of the usual suspects in their mix. And then they buy power on the market, like everybody else does. And so, no, it's not net metered. It's a contracted, a negotiated contract deal that's done based on the economics of the system.
I've heard stories of communities where they're putting in wind farms, and there's always a few folks that don't like how they look, the sound, whatever. Do you find when it's community-based that when people realize that there's going to be an economic development, long-term economic development or benefit for them, are people more receptive?
There's a huge difference. We've seen that many times. Community-based development, when you have the communities involved in the ownership of it, they have a whole different light than if they know that some big corporation owns that, and that they're looking at those things every day, and they're saying, well, I don't like the look of them because we have no value there. And you're starting to see that in a large way. All over the country, the NIMBYs are coming out, but in all of our developments, no matter where it's been, community-based development does not have those issues because we bring the community in as they're the owners of the project, they're partners in the project, and we kind of look at it like hog barns. It's not like hog barns, but to some people that smells like money. But it has a big difference when you have an ownership in it, or your cousin does, or your nephew, or somebody has a job or an ownership or part of that project. It has a big impact on the local community acceptance of the project, and it's been very successful.
Are lights necessary for air traffic? Do you ever have trouble with birds? And is insurance necessary for like tornadoes?
Okay. Air traffic? Well, we do. Anytime you put a wind turbine in it and you're over 200 feet, you have to go to the FAA and you do a point study, and so they tell you whether you're a hazard. And if they feel you're a hazard, they'll say, I wouldn't build there, or put a light on it, or something. But because technically the FAA can't say you can't put one there unless if you try to pull them into the runway, they could probably do that. Technically they can't, but if you do it against their okay, then you're completely liable for anybody that hits it. And so it's a real financial deterrent. Birds and bats. When I built Woodstock, they made me do a $40,000 study, which was a lot of money at the time, to study whether birds were going to run into my wind turbine. And I went, wow, I think my birds are smarter than your birds, but they didn't think so, so we had to do the study. They never found any birds or nothing. And a lot of the bird issue came from in the 80s when we were building wind farms in the Altamont Pass in California. And the Altamont Pass is just outside of San Francisco, and it's one of the last bastions in that area where there aren't a lot of people. And so that's where the birds like to live, especially the red-tailed hawk. And in the first projects that were built out there, if you go out there and look at the old U.S. wind farm machines, and that's a downwind machine. What that means is that if this is the tower, and the blades are here, and so the wind passes through the tower and hits the blades. That's called a downwind. And so what would happen is the birds of prey would sit on the tower, which was a lattice tower, and they'd sit there and they would see lunch, and they'd say, ooh, and they'd fly off and they'd flare into the wind, take them into the rotor, kill them. Nowadays, all of the turbines are upwind. So the rotors face, the wind goes through like this, and they're all tubular towers. And so there's no place for the birds to perch, and they don't fly into them. And a hawk can see a mouse at 3,000 feet. If you can't see that wind turbine blade, maybe that's natural selection. We have never had an issue with birds. And the other thing too in California that got a lot of attention was that when they built the feeder lines from where the wind turbines were to the interconnected into the system, they built the feeder lines and they were about this far apart. It was 12,500 volt feeder lines, and so the birds would land on one and he'd touch the other. And so that did most of the damage. So, birds is really not an issue. It has never been. The Europeans build wind farms